Cool. So your question is around lease agreements, and it is quite topical, especially with the war that's now taking place, and the fact that there's a lot of South African residents or citizens that simply can't make their way back to South Africa. And there's lease agreements in place where people are supposed to be paying rent, they're supposed to be moving in, they're supposed to be moving out. Life carries on in South Africa. Landlords still have these properties. They expect tenants to act in a certain way, but this war is now resulting in hindrances or difficulties, rather. So in this particular question, this tenant is unable to return in time, presumably, in order to be able to vacate the premises prior to the expiration of the lease in order for new tenants to move in, right? So it's not that he's not paying rent. It's none of that. It's just because he cannot fly back. So he cannot do certain things directly or personally. How do you how do you deal with this from a force majeure perspective or an impossibility perspective? Contractually, who needs to do what here?
Perfect. So just before I get into the question, I want to deal with two basic principles that we have in South African law and particularly in contract law. Okay, and the first one I'm going to deal with is impossibility. So there are a number of elements for a valid contract to exist in South African law, which I'm not going to get into, but there is one particular exception which is applicable in this particular case, and that is impossibility. Now, the general principle is that parties cannot enter into contracts which would amount to an impossibility. If you try and enforce such a contract in a court of law, the court will not enforce such a contract. So to give an easy example of this, in our letting sphere, if you try to lease a property which doesn't exist, okay, there is not going to be enforceability of that contract. You can't enforce that contract in a court of law. Okay, so it seems like an obvious thing, but it is important for the purposes of this question. If something is truly impossible, it can't be enforced. You cannot create a contract around it. So that's our first principle. The second principle is one that we are all familiar with after COVID, which is force majeure. Okay, this is a Latin term that we use that relates to acts of God. Okay, so in certain circumstances where a contract is exists between parties, but the performance of that contract is either in whole or part interrupted by an act of God, a force majeure, okay, there are legal consequences as a result of this for the parties involved, which can include that the parties can escape the terms of the particular contract without consequence to one another or with consequence to one another. It does depend on what your contract holds in the circumstances, okay? But it is very possible in a circumstance where there is a force majeure that a contract might become unenforceable due to whatever that particular event is, okay? So these are two principles that we need to keep in our mind with regards to this particular question. Now, as Bruno's pointed out, we've got a war going on, unfortunately, in the Middle East, and that might have consequences for us here in South Africa. And in particular, in the question today, it was a question of, well, what happens to my lease agreement? Because I'm now stuck in the Middle East. I can't get back. I can't vacate the premises, or I can't take occupation of the premises. Is this a case of either impossibility or force majeure? And unfortunately, in circumstances like this, it's not going to fall into either of those particular categories. Firstly, as far as force majeure goes, force majeure is not going to extend as far as a war, okay? And in particular, considering that this war is halfway across the world, although it might have a material effect on the individual who has entered into this contract, this is not what a force majeure is in terms of the definition of force majeure. Force majeure is obviously, you've got to think something that's natural and occurs around the particular property itself. Okay, so I don't think that force majeure would extend as far as the tenants in this particular circumstances. And insofar as impossibility is concerned, I think we can all agree that although a tenant might be stuck and unable to travel back to South Africa because of an ongoing war in the Middle East, that does not in of itself make it impossible for that property to be let to that person. Okay, you can still rent out a property even if your intention is never to occupy that particular property. There's nothing in law that stops you from doing that. So although our writer says that they are unable to come back to South Africa at this point, that is not in of itself an impossibility in as far as the law is concerned. Okay. So it's important to know in this particular question that what the writers asked us is it possible is the lease agreement either no longer valid, or can they get out of the lease agreement for these two particular reasons? My answer in the circumstances is no. What is important to remember is inconvenience or costly compliance with an agreement is still an ability to comply with an agreement. So our tenants have said they can't get back to South Africa, they can't vacate the premises, and remove the stuff themselves. That may be so in the circumstances of this case, but that doesn't make it impossible. You can still take extra steps, even though they may be more costly or inconvenient to you, to comply and say vacate the premises. That might include appointing a locksmith or appointing some sort of agent who can assist you to move the things out of the property. And that would be the correct thing to do, to take those steps in the circumstances. From a legal perspective, you can't just throw your hands up and go, well, because I can't do it in my own personal capacity myself, impossibility is the answer in the circumstances. That's particular with lease agreements. There might be other agreements that differ, but in the particular circumstance of our case, certainly not impossible.
Absolutely. Awesome. Thanks, Nick.
Perfect. Thank you, Bruno. We will see you next week.
Awesome. Have a great one.
Yes.